Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait just a few seconds while everyone comes into the webinar, and we'll get started in just a moment. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain, and I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here at Providence College and the director of the forum. The Humanities Forum, now in its 6th year, exists to provide a regular space on campus for the entire college community to reflect on some of the deepest human things. We host guests from on and off campus and include artistic performances, lectures, panel discussions, debates, and film screenings. We have an exciting schedule of events still to come this semester, and our schedule and recordings of past events are always available on our website. It's my pleasure now to introduce today's event, a collaboration between the Forum and the Frederick Douglass Project here at PC, made possible in part by the generous support of the Jack Miller Center. The host of today's forum is Professor Ian Bernhoft, a member of the Providence College English Department and the organizer of the Frederick Douglass Project. Today's guest is the second of 3 special guests hosted by the forum this spring in connection with the Frederick Douglass Project. As a reminder, today's presentation and discussion will be recorded and made available on our website early next week. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I turn things over now to Professor Bernhoft, who will introduce today's guest.
All right. Welcome to the Humanities Forum today. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Bryan Garsten, who is a professor of political science and the chair of the Humanities program at Yale University. Professor Garsten focuses in his work on questions of political rhetoric and deliberation, the meaning of representative democracy, the relationship of politics and religion, and the place of emotions in political life. His book, Saving Persuasion, A Defense of Rhetoric and Judgment, came out in 2006 from Harvard University Press. And for those of you who are students in the persuasion colloquium that I'm teaching, that was one of the main inspirations for that class. So you can either thank or silently regret Professor Garsten's output, depending on how you feel about that class. But he's currently at work finishing a book called The Heart of a Heartless World. It examines the ethical, political, and religious core of early 19th century liberalism in the United States and France. And he also runs an initiative through Yale called Citizens, Thinkers, Writers, which is a summer program which introduces rising seniors from the New Haven public schools to the rigors of college and the pleasures of the great books. And before I turn the microphone over to Professor Garsten, I want to tell you about another part of the Frederick Douglass Project, which Professor Hain referred to. And that is, we're having the first annual Frederick Douglass Essay and Public Speaking Contest coming up this coming month in April. This is open to all PC undergraduates, and it asks students to compose a short persuasive essay or a short persuasive speech in which you address a pressing problem that is confronting the United States, Rhode Island, Providence, or Providence College. And so in this contest, you're going to diagnose a problem, show why it matters, and make a compelling case about what to do about it to an audience that might not share your assumptions, beliefs, or political convictions. And there's prize money attached to that. Flyers are circulating. And it gives you an opportunity to cultivate in yourself the skills of reasoned debate and persuasion, which I believe Professor Garsten will be arguing are necessary to a healthy and free society. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and turn the mic over to Professor Bryan Garsten.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I know it's a beautiful day out, so thanks for tuning into this, and thanks so much to Professor Bernhoft for inviting me. I do believe that trying to persuade your fellow citizens who might disagree with you is one of the fundamental acts of democratic citizenship, that it involves a kind of mix of obedience and rule. Obedience because you have to figure out what they think and target your argument to them. And so you have to sort of follow them, your audience, in a way. But rule because you're trying to persuade them of something, you're trying to move them in a certain direction. But today I'm actually going to focus not on the admirable source of persuasion, but on a defective sort, demagoguery. And you probably have heard this word. It comes from the Greek, meaning leader of the people, but it's developed over time a negative connotation. A demagogue is not just a leader of the people, but someone who leads the people in particular ways. And there are a set of definitions that have arisen over time, which are kind of standard. They usually emphasize the way a demagogue appeals to passions, sometimes to angry passions, the way a demagogue appeals to prejudices, often scapegoating a certain group for the problems of society. Demagogues tend to appeal to a hatred of elites that naturally arises in democratic societies. And I think all of these definitions are useful and right. But I also have been thinking lately about a different way of approaching the topic of demagoguery, and that's what I want to sort of talk with you about for a little while today, and then we'll have some conversation and questions. And the different way of thinking about demagoguery is this. I think part of what a demagogue does that is pernicious and disruptive is that a demagogue excuses us from self-government. So let me take a little while to explain what I mean. First of all, this term self-government I'm using very particularly, as opposed to democracy or equality or freedom. And I'm using it because self-government brings along with it two meanings rather than one, right? You can think of self-government on the individual level. You, as a person, have to govern yourself. And then, of course, you can think of self-government on the collective level. We, as a people, are meant to try to govern ourselves. And I mean that a demagogue invites us in different ways to abandon self-government in both dimensions, in both the individual and the collective sphere. And they do that by flattering us in a certain way. So let me say there are a few topics I'm going to go over now, just a few points really to make. One will be about flattery, so I'll come back to that. One will be about regret. And then the third point will be about constitutions and how to think about constitutions. Because the argument I want to make overall is that we all, as human beings, face the question of under what conditions do we make the best decisions? We all, as human beings, can be lured into conditions under which we're less likely to make good decisions. We all experience regret for not making the decisions we wish we would have made. And I want to suggest that constitutions, a constitutional framework, have been understood and still can be understood as technologies or techniques designed to create conditions under which we're more likely to make better decisions. So that's a quick version of the argument I want to make. Let me circle back and slow down on some of that. So first, look, the connection between demagogues and flattery is very, very old. It goes back to Plato in ancient Greece, who in a work called the Gorgias described democratic leadership as it was emerging in Athens as too often falling into a form of flattery, of telling the people what they want to hear rather than what they should hear, to make them better. And for a long time, I taught the dialogue, read it, but didn't think hard about this idea of flattery, because it didn't seem to me a very political phenomenon, flattery, or at least not in democracies. We're accustomed to thinking of flattery, I think, in monarchies or autocracies. That is, we know to worry about the person standing next to the ruler, whispering in that ruler's ear, flattering him and influencing him through that flattery. Uh, any Lord of the Rings fans will know about, is it Wormtongue, who's a flatterer who stands next to the king of Rohan, one of these kingdoms in Tolkien. But that's kind of a typical depiction of the flatterer. But as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes and others noticed, that same phenomenon happens in democracies. So there it's the people who are the rulers, but we can still be whispered to or flattered by those who want to wield influence. And in fact, Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 1600s, went so far as to worry that all democracies were really what he called aristocracies of orators. And then he went on to explain that all democracies were susceptible to this sort of flattery from those who seek influence and power. So I think we should think about this phenomenon of flattery, and think in a very kind of reflective, personal way first, before we jump to a political level. You know, we each are susceptible to flattery because we each nourish these kind of secret prides. There are things about ourselves that we secretly take pride in, even if we're humble in other ways. You know, I may think there are plenty of people who are smarter than me, who are stronger than me, more talented, but maybe deep inside, I think at least I'm sympathetic to people who are feeling pain. Or a different person may notice that others are better than her in all sorts of ways, but she thinks deep down, at least she's diligent and conscientious and not lazy. They're different characteristics, but we tend to each have some secret pride. And what a flatterer does is find that pride. It's not as hard as we think it is from the outside to figure out what it is for each of us. And a flatterer finds that secret pride and uses it. There's a great work, if you're interested, by Plutarch, called How to Distinguish a Flatterer from a Friend, with all of these subtle tips, very practical, but subtle tips about how to do this, like voice a strong opinion. A flatterer will usually express agreement with it, and then change your mind and see if the supposed friend also quick changes their mind. If so, warning, potential flatterer, and all sorts of tips like that. Well, there are some secret prides that I think are generalizable. That is, they're commonly found amongst us. And one of them, this is going very quickly now, but just to put it on the table, one of them is this. I think many of us secretly have a sense that the world should reflect our desires, should be responsive to us somehow. That we, and it's a pride because it's a belief that we at least deserve to be responded to. And that is at base a kind of desire for mastery. And demagogues can tap into that. Because see, a demagogue offers to take our wish and impress it on the world in a way that we have not been able to. Perhaps we've been held back by the sense that it would take criminal actions or at least unethical actions to really push our views onto the world. Perhaps we've been held back by more ordinary reticence or shyness or incompetence or weakness. But the demagogue offers to take our view and march forward against the stultifying powers that be of convention or institutions or elite interests of other kinds that stand in the way of achieving our desires. And we put our agency onto them. We hope they will accomplish what we think should be accomplished for us. Plato, when he talked about flattery, used a different but equally personal, ordinary, everyday way of thinking in at least two places, in this dialogue called Gorgias and in his famous, much larger dialogue called the Republic. He used an analogy to food, to the question of what we eat. You know, sometimes you read these very old books and you come across a sentence or a passage which reveals just in an instant that in spite of all the incredible differences between us and them, the people writing so long ago, there are these commonalities. And one of those sentences for me is in Plato's Republic, Book 8, when he says that he's describing what citizens are like in a democracy. And he says in just half a sentence, they're always going on and off diets and exercise routines. And it blew my mind. First, the idea that ancient Athenians were doing this. And second, the idea that it had anything to do with our political character, that there's something about democratic life with its freedom that leaves us at sea about what to eat, and therefore with the burden of choosing what to eat, and therefore leaves us, cycling through this kind of disciplined approach, and then conceding to our desires for this or that, and then regretting it. This cycle of dieting is an example of the human dilemma of choice. And in the dialogue called the Gorgias, it's really the same metaphor that's used when the accusation is that demagogues are like pastry chefs. That is, like people who prepare food which appeals immediately, which people immediately want to eat. It's sweet, but which may not be good for us. So the demagogue is not forcing us to choose this or that, but the demagogue is presenting us with things that are tempting without concern for whether they're good for us or not. Now, I don't know how many of you have thought hard about what you eat or worked hard on that as a project, tried to control it. It's an astonishingly difficult endeavor. It's not just that one is tempted by sweet food. There's a wonderful book by Michael Pollan, the food writer, called The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is really about this. So humans are omnivores. We can eat many different things. That's a kind of freedom we have, like rats. But we therefore face the choice always about what to eat. And that choice can be overwhelming. And it raises the question of how we make that choice. Often it's our inherited traditions, certain cultural foods that we tasted at home growing up that appeal to us. So those are kind of traditions, patterns we fall into. But as those patterns, as we experience new alternatives, the patterns are no longer dictate so much what we choose, and we're left in this dilemma of choice. And that's where the demagogue or the pastry chef can become most influential, most dangerous. And then, of course, there's the question: under what conditions do we make the best choices about what to eat? I know it seems we've moved far from politics, but democratic politics is in the end a question of how people choose, how we, the people, choose. And it's an illusion to think that our choices in the domain of politics are of a wholly different kind than our choices in general, including choices about the things that affect us most immediately, like what to put into our bodies. So flattery is one part of the phenomenon of choice related to demagoguery. Now, when you eat what you don't want to eat, often later on you feel regret. We ordered pizza last night. I ate a bunch. Then I ate a bunch of leftovers for lunch today. Then I feel regret. That's a recognizable political phenomenon too, going back just as far. Maybe one of the most famous episodes is in Thucydides, when the Athenians debate what to do about this colony, the Mytileneans, who have not been loyal. And the Athenians decide in a burst of anger just to kill everyone, even those who weren't involved in the treachery. And then the next day they have another debate and they regret their decision and they send off another ship quick to try to change that to a slightly less harsh response. Or Athens kills the philosopher Socrates, and famously, we're told by Diogenes Laertius and others, soon regrets that decision to kill Socrates. And you could come up with your own examples from much more recent history. Some people might regret the US invasion of Iraq under the second President Bush. Other people look back and regret the internment of the Japanese during the Second World War that happened in California. The phenomenon of regret is a familiar one, just as the phenomenon of having to decide what to eat is a familiar one. And the reason I use these kind of very familiar personal examples is that otherwise we forget about these psychological phenomena, like the need to guard against flattery, like the phenomenon of regret. And yet those phenomena were really front of mind for the constitutional framers when they designed our system of government. So I've written and said elsewhere that the Constitution of the United States was written partly as a technology or to manage or minimize our susceptibility to demagoguery. Another way of saying that is that it was meant to put decision makers in conditions in which they were less likely to be susceptible to flattery and less likely to make decisions that they would come to regret. And you can see this if you just look at in the Federalist Papers, written to persuade New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. For example, the Federalist Papers on the Senate explicitly invoke the example of Athenians killing Socrates and regretting it, and portray the Senate as an effort to create an institution less likely to make such mistakes. Now, it's crucial here to distinguish that way of thinking about it from a more general suspicion of the people. Often people say that the Senate, a very kind of indirect form of representative government, especially as originally designed, where senators were not popularly elected, but selected by state legislators. That's often portrayed as the result of an aristocratic suspicion of the people, that the people were ignorant of necessary facts and uneducated in terms of their tastes and understanding of the world. And I'm sure there was some of that behind the design, but those are not the arguments that are made most in the Federalist Papers. Instead, the argument is that anyone, if not in the right conditions, anyone making decisions as part of a group is susceptible to various dynamics that will make their decision-making worse. And I think the famous line there is probably when Publius in the Federalist Papers writes, had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. So there's the recognition that that what is true of each one of us, that under certain background conditions, we are more likely to make good decisions, is also true of us together as a political people. That the same individuals with the same education, training, and so on can, in certain conditions, act in a more mob-like way, and in other conditions, act in a more deliberate way. And the hope of the Senate was to create the conditions to develop what they called the cool and deliberate sense of the community. The cool and deliberate sense of the community. So I'm not sure that the Senate, as it was designed, works for this anymore. I'm not sure that the constitutional structure we've got exactly as designed in fact, does create the conditions for good decision-making anymore. But I remain persuaded that the problem the constitutional framers were trying to address remains a problem for us, because it seems to be a sort of perpetual human problem: how to create the conditions for better decision-making. And with that in mind, and looking at the time, let me just briefly mention one decision that is very much in the news every few years, that we all make as citizens, not just the representatives, and that we could think about from this perspective, and that's the decision of who to select as president of the country. So there we have a choice to make. And political scientists, have gone back and forth about the question of how much people know. That is, do ordinary citizens know the basic facts of politics? And they discover again and again that most citizens don't know many facts. But then another group of political scientists comes back and says, well, they don't know the facts, but they know enough to take cues from people who do know the facts, or they have a more general and more reliable sense of what's what. So there's a back and forth about how much citizens know, but that back and forth never really takes into account the question that I'm proposing, which is, under what conditions do citizens judge best? Now, think of the problem of designing a method to select a president that took that question seriously. Would we design the system we've got now? I'm not sure we would. I'm not sure we would. And perhaps we could talk more about that in the Q&A. There are a whole set of questions revolving around institutions, around parties, around primaries, around the Electoral College, and so on. But what I wanted to foreground today was this more basic orientation towards those familiar institutional questions, and especially the dual character of self-government. Self-government for us as a collective, we the people, was always thought to require self-government of each one of us as individuals. And the link between those two forms of self-government, I think, is often underemphasized recently. And it's underemphasized especially because, and this will be my concluding point, because it's not just individual politicians who are flattering us in our politics. That is, demagoguery is not just a problem of individual politicians, a Huey Long, from the 1930s, Louisiana, or other famous examples. If we think of demagoguery in the way I've been describing it, as a sort of flattery promising us attention and agency, then from a certain vantage point, the media world that we have created for ourselves recently is fundamentally demagogic. I mean, think of it for a moment. You sit down at these screens, and it seems as though enormous powers of information retrieval and communication are at your disposal at any time of day, waiting to be deployed by you. You have a question? Sit down whenever you like and get an answer. You have a desire for a thing? Sit down at almost any time you like and find that desire fulfilled. There is an incredible flattery that goes along with this sense of always being addressed and attended to, which I think we don't even really notice. And here's when I first noticed it. I turned on my computer for something, and that little round spinning wheel came up. And I felt furious impatience. it was up for maybe 20 seconds. Now that impatience is familiar. That is the impatience that a master feels when the slave is slow to reply. Is there a danger that we are accustoming ourselves to a kind of responsiveness that turns us into masters rather than citizens? Citizenship involves waiting, involves coming up against the wishes of others and the stubborn facts of the world, and slowing down and working together to figure out how to navigate those. But mastery involves getting a quick response to one's whims. And I don't want to exaggerate this. I know there's lots of cultural criticism about the internet. I don't think it's the internet's all bad or anything like that. But there's a sense in which there's a demagogic flattery involved in the experience. And the danger that I'm concerned about is that we develop attitudes that we can't help but carry over into politics. And that makes us more susceptible to leaders who promise to adapt to those attitudes. They promise the kind of quick agency and even mastery that we've learned to crave more and more. And that, I think, would be a real threat to our republic. So let me stop there, and hopefully we can have conversation and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Garsten. I was remiss in not informing those of you who are watching that the Q&A box is and has been open throughout. So if you could have already been entering your questions, but now you really can, because you know. And I will be asking as many as I can in the remaining time we have with Professor Garsten. So one question though that I had, because right away the way you described the position of the demagogue in terms of this sort of deferral of agency onto someone else that flatters our sense that the world will be responsive to our desires. That sounds exactly like the cult of the modern presidency. And not just Donald Trump, right? That we assume that whoever is in office will somehow do the things that we want them to do and fix the things for us. And so the only way in which notions of citizenship come out is every 4 years, in the sense of that, yes, you have to vote, and then your guy or your woman is going to do that which you desire to have done. And I'm wondering what you think the size of our republic, how that features into it.
Yeah.
I know you said, maybe the whole system we have isn't an optimal one, but both in that moment of, the individual citizen thinking, well, I don't have any say over anything, but I can elect the person who controls things because it's such a big country. And also what you said about where that line from the Federalist Papers about where every Athenian is Socrates, an assembly of Athenians would still be a mob. I'm wondering if a logical conclusion of this attentiveness to the dangers of flattery would lead us towards smaller and smaller forms of local government.
Good, yeah. I think scale is a huge issue, and it was seen that way, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when not only in the U.S., our constitutional framers were coming up with the Constitution, but then in France after the Revolution, when they were trying to come up with a representative form of government for that, a relatively big country, size was seen as a huge problem, and it had always been supposed that a republic, sort of participatory democratic form of government, could only work on the level of a city, really. And part of the innovation, both in the US and France, was to say, no, there's a version that can work on a much larger scale. We can be an empire, but still be a representative republic. But both of those systems really did envision a much more decentralized form of governance, where the national government existed to put into place the conditions under which much more local Republican forms of government could do their work. So there were things that the national government had to do, like most obviously security. So the first 10 or so Federalist Papers are actually all about foreign relations, about the fact that if the colonies didn't unite together in a stronger way, they'd be prey to the European powers, and couldn't expect to be effective republics. And then over time, more and more sort of preconditions of effective Republican government came, it seemed, to fall under the national competence. But I agree with you that the thrust of thinking this way is to focus on the local. Now, there's a question of whether what local is changing because of our amazing technologies, our amazing communications, our amazing transportation. So surely the notion of what's local is changing, and I think that's so. I can't advocate going back to the 18th, 19th century view of what that is, but at a level of abstraction, one step higher than that, some notion of the local will be important if we want agency to ever be more than casting one vote that doesn't mean very much for a very, very distant leader.
So we could start a Make America Small Again platform. A question in the chat. So you lay out the constraints that technology places on the habits necessary for self-rule. But what kind of opportunities, if any, do you think technology offers to cultivate habits of citizenship?
Yeah, good. Well, the most obvious, maybe there are two most obvious. One, information. It is astonishing the information you can gather to yourself if you're interested in a particular issue. Want to gather facts either about the government or about the state of the world, on climate or on healthcare provisions in a certain area and so on, or on the budget of your state, on education, whatever it is. The information gathering is quite amazing. And then obviously the communication is amazing too. And that does pose the question of what kind of community these forms of communication can form. And there, I think we still have a lot of thinking to do. And I'm not sure what I think, honestly. I think they're clearly all forms of community that are being experimented with online. There are clearly senses in which those forms of community are different from what you find in a geographical community. For example, a storm will hit a geographical community all at once, out of the blue. They're all subject to fate, to accident, in a way that a more scattered online community might be or might not be. And more generally, the online communities generally are chosen. We can choose them. We join one, maybe we unjoin later on. Maybe other people unfriend us. But there's its element of choice in the online communities that the communication allows. That's not always true, or that's less seamless in the physical world. Yes, you can always move to a different town, but that's not a small thing. That involves significant effort. So there's a stickiness to geographical communities and a givenness to them that's different from the online world. And that element of choice in the online world may be an element of the flattery that I'm talking about. The idea that you can choose, that community is something you choose rather than something you inherit or partly inherit or fall into by accident. And that may affect our patience and our commitment to make the community as good as it can be, because we're always facing the possibility of exit. Do we invest more time into this community, or do we just try a different one? When that's always a choice for us, it does affect our sense of citizenship. Just think of what the equivalent is in geographical citizenship. I mean, lots of people joked over the last 4 years, I'm out of here. I'm off to Canada or somewhere else. But few people actually did that. Few people left because mostly it's not a matter of very light, easy choice like that. And that stickiness can help us be motivated to work to do the hard work that citizenship requires.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like increased choice is inevitably going to dilute the bonds of community. That robust communities, almost of necessity, have to grow out of limitation, constraint, and an absence of choice in some respect.
Well, I mean, I do think I want to say I think it's a mixed blessing, sort of. I mean, being stuck in some families or communities is just awful. I mean, they can be oppressive and they can be irredeemable, and I'm on the side of the refugees, those who leave. But yes, then I think there's also something to what you're saying too, that if that choice becomes too easy or too common, then the ties that bind us do seem inevitably loosened. Now, on the other side, those will say, well, let people move around and find their best community, their most authentic partners. And there's something to that too. That's why I say I'm a little ambivalent.
There's one other question in the queue which touches on community and technology, actually. So is technology's ability to give people quick access to a tight-knit community of shared values the main reason why we find people unable to even contemplate alternative thinking? And is that tied to the flattery given to us, as you described, by technology?
Yeah, I think that very much gets to the point we were just talking about. And I think recognizing this as a form of flattery, I mean, it's a somewhat new thought for me, but I'm struck by it. The idea that the world that the people we're surrounded by should somehow resonate with our own views. Why is that? I mean, that seems to be a rather flattering thought. There. I don't know if anyone reads the novels of Richard Russo. He writes about these small post-industrial towns in New England. And what I like about them is it's always a group of it's a motley crew of characters who just kind of ended up together and are doing their best to make it through together. And it's full of friction and grievance. But it's also full of genuine human interaction because of that. And those communities certainly are not chosen. I mean, most people feel stuck in them because those who could easily leave have left. So I think there's a lot behind that question. Yeah.
Another one from the queue. The social media environment seems to encourage a desire for flattery, with that you want likes, you want people to love your post, to retweet you, and at the same time discouraging debate. And the questioner says, I'm thinking of the potential to censor the comments of others on your posts and curate your own public. How might we engage more responsibly online or more intentionally so as to encourage civic discourse, or is it better just to move offline?
I don't know, personal decision. I mean, I'm very much not on social media, so I'm probably not the best qualified to talk about it. And I have a friend who says I shouldn't talk about it at all. But I do dip in. Enough to get a sense of it. I want to say, look, there will be better and worse ways to be online. Mm-hmm. And we're still very early in this set of experiments, really. So I think the main thing is to be aware of this danger and to look for forms of being online that are not demagogic, that don't merely flatter us. And I think there are some experiments like that. there's an email you can sign up for that will give you different political perspectives on the news of the day every day or every week. You'll just get that in your inbox. Flip side, I think it's called, something like that. And that's just a small example. I think our experiment in self-government depends on us finding better ways of being together online.
Yeah, I've noticed when I go on Facebook or look at Twitter that, thinking back to what you were saying about your experience of recognizing how our technological present flatters us, I do notice that it seems to be one of the major pleasures of social media is the pleasure of feeling more right than other people, or watching other people be exposed for how wrong they are. That it seems like it flatters us intellectually as well as socially.
Well, can I just point out how similar that is to the feeling, if you watch Huey Long or some other example of a demagogue, often you can tell that part of what the audience is getting is a sense of like, finally someone is saying it like it is, and finally someone is getting it right. It is a feeling of vindication.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the experience of it, and so it's just another sign of the commonality here.
I appreciate how tactfully you've avoided any references to our previous president, but certainly that aspect was in play with him, right? That he was willing to say things that his supporters felt people would refuse to say, and then finally somebody is saying what we want to hear. Do you think, you were alerting us to some of the ways encouraging us to recognize the ways in which we're susceptible to flattery. Do you think that if we're looking to cultivate a sort of immune response system to demagoguery in ourselves and our fellow citizens, to what extent can intellection actually get us there? If I tell myself, oh, well, I now recognize the ways in which I'm susceptible to flattery, am I simply just flattering myself that I'm smarter than people who are susceptible to flattery?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I also like the idea of an immune, maybe we're all thinking about this these days, an immune response to demagoguery. I do think it's very easy to underestimate the extent to which we are susceptible to flattery, all of us. In my experience, the level of education doesn't really do anything to immunize us against it. The forms of flattery may be different, but the phenomenon is still there. I think that the best vaccine is a certain kind of experience of working together with others. Again, this is kind of in small scale ways, I think, to get things done in the world, because the people who have that experience will tend to be suspicious of those who promise over easy answers, or to those who over promise. And that suspicion is a very helpful weapon against demagogues. Whereas those of us who work most with symbols on screens really have become accustomed to a world in which it's very easy to move things around and reorganize things. And the more one works with symbols, you can forget about the real pushback of the concrete physical world, forget how hard it is, to get shots into arms, for example, just that physical movement of material. So I think the suspicion that comes from, what Weber called the long, slow, or hard boring of boards, that's how he described politics, the actual work of politics. The suspicion that that sort of experience brings about overambitious claims that someone else can quickly, easily accomplish what you in your heart want to be accomplished is the best vaccine.
seems like there's a pattern which I see between, your argument here and other arguments that have to do with how should we engage in the modern world in light of the ways in which technology and consumer culture has reshaped us. And all of them seem to involve some sort of willful embrace of what's difficult, or willful embrace of reality, right? Of subjecting yourself to limits that you're being told you don't have to subject yourself to. So, in your case, embracing the drudgery and the tedium and the frustrations of working with people who you may not work well with, or who you disagree with, or so on and so forth. And so it seems like, and people say they want this, my students will say, oh, we want less readily available technology. We know that we do better with certain constraints, but it seems like it's awfully hard to move people from being persuaded that this is something to embrace to actually embracing it.
Just on that point, I mean, we need help. I mean, and that's why institutions, and so we can build, hopefully, I mean, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the idea was to build institutions to help people, because on your own, it's too much to ask for us just to spontaneously do this. So the institutions were meant to create patterns of behavior that slow things down, for example, or create new obstacles to quick choice. And I'm not sure that, again, that those exact institutions will work in our day, but that problem of institutionalization remains. And I think that people are so distrustful of institutions at our moment that we're not thinking enough about how to design new ones to help us with this general problem for our time.
One question that I have is thinking a little bit more about questions of ideas about choice and identity in the contemporary moment. It seems like we're always heading towards accepting less and less restraint, right? In terms of, embracing more and more choice in terms of what our allegiances are, who we are, etc. And it seems like it would be politically impalatable to try to scale that back, that it would seem like an incursion on liberty. And so I'm wondering, how do you think about the contemporary moment with the emphasis on identity politics and the sort of lionization of choice? Do you see that as necessarily a threat or intention with notions of citizenship, or is there a way to embrace those contemporary commitments and still recuperate some sort of strong notion of citizenship that's grounded in limits and grounded in embracing the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me say about this notion of freedom. The ordinary, I think American view of freedom is not being restricted. But I spent a lot of time reading Tocqueville. I know some of your students read Tocqueville in classes, and he described freedom very differently, really. He described it as an art. That is something you have to learn, a set of habits and practices. And I think if we think of freedom more that way, then there's much less of a conflict between freedom and citizenship. Because in fact, for him, freedom was, those arts were arts of working together, essentially. And those arts kind of trained us in citizenship, or they were citizenship. So I think we need to think hard about what we mean by freedom, and therefore what we mean by choice. And I think even choice is much more complicated than we like to think about it. People think about like an abstract will that just chooses, but we're not made up that way. I don't think psychologically. We have desires, yes, and then we have our reflections about our desires, and so we can feel emotions about our desires, like we can feel ashamed of them or embarrassed about them, other things. And then we have frustrations about whether we're able to fulfill our desire. And so we have these layers, and choosing is not just about like following a desire. It usually involves all of these layers. And so that's why I think we can design institutions that are responsive to the fact that we are layered in this way, and kind of use our emotions, our more complicated emotions, to put us in a better position as we make choices. So in other words, big picture, I don't think you have to be against freedom or against choice in a simple way in order to stand up for citizenship of the kind you're describing. I think you have to think harder about what freedom really is and what choice really is. Sort of slow down and think about that pretty carefully. And then some of these over-stylized conflicts, I think, ease up a bit.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose you could make the case that given the greater attention to systems and structures and institutional energies that's present in political discourse, they might help create a space for thinking more purposefully about institutions, essentially. One thing I think is particularly provocative and interesting about your approach to demagoguery here, but let me make sure that I'm not misrepresenting you, is that a lot of the time discourse about demagoguery tends to be a more elite discourse about what the masses are susceptible to, right? And that plays into certain perhaps inimical tendencies towards the relation between the elites and the polloi in contemporary America. And it seems like your model is rather shifting that we should understand demagoguery more in terms of how we encounter the world. That might be a too abstract way to say it, but that it isn't a matter of sort of an intellectual class against the base, but rather a matter of what is our self-understanding of our relation to the world and how are we engaging with it? Do I have you right there? Would you?
Yes, and I think there's a good place to be as we start to finish up. That is what's weird about my presentation. I mean, a lot of presentations about demagogues would focus on the demagogues, and I used to give those presentations, and I would show video clips of Huey Long or Hitler or others, and we'd focus on their characteristics, and that's worth doing. But lately, I'm interested in their audiences. That is us, the rest of us, and what makes us, all of us, I think, susceptible to different forms of demagoguery. And I'm partly interested in that because of what you said. The concern about demagoguery can seem to be an anti-democratic concern, right? If you're worried that the demagogue is riling up the people because they're going to stir up the status quo, which you feel pretty happy with, then that's one form of concern about demagoguery. But I don't think concern with demagoguery is only that. I don't think it's only an elite concern with a rebellious people. I think it's a concern with how the people can be manipulated, with how certain leaders claim to speak for the people, but then act in very different ways, and so betray the people, and how all of us can be distracted from the very hard work of self-government and institution building and institution sustaining that we really need to focus on.
Seems like a succinct note to end on. So let's thank Professor Garsten for joining us today. I'm sorry for any questions we didn't get to, and I'm going to stop the recording here, and then we'll presumably chit chat for a minute or two. But
thanks so much for having me.
It was a delight.